I have to say that as we were singing these songs this morning, and as I was reflecting upon the many and varied struggles that we have had as a congregation this week, there was a part of me that wanted to pull a radical sort of, switcheroo here and do something else this morning. And sometimes that is the right thing to do. But sometimes what we need when life has been chaos is to just have a little bit of normality. And I think that's what I've settled on this morning. As you know, for the last 3 weeks, we have been laying a biblical foundation for the teaching that we're looking at this morning. Now we finally get to the teaching itself. And what we observe is that Jesus has 2 things on his mind: what it means to be human and what it means to live as a citizen of the kingdom of God. And it is these 2 ideas, along with Jesus' understanding of marriage itself, that shape his teaching on divorce. Now, let's begin by setting the stage for this episode that we see here. Because what happens when we open chapter 19, Jesus moves his ministry from Galilee to Judea. Now, this move is important geographically. It moves Jesus closer to the heart of Jewish identity and power. But it is also important for the flow of Matthew's narrative. You see, in the way that Matthew constructs his narrative, Jesus' public ministry from chapter 5 onward has been exclusively in Galilee. That's where it's been. And now Matthew is signaling to you, we are moving into a new phase of this narrative, and he does so by moving Jesus geographically. Okay? Now we also want to observe something important about the historical background. The question that is brought to Jesus, we'll come to that question in a moment, was just one of several questions that divided the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees are one school, you might say, or one sect in Jewish life. There are the Sadducees, there are the Essenes, there are probably some groups that we don't even know about. There are the Zealots, but Zealots could overlap sometimes with Pharisees. So it's Pharisees that are coming and talking to Jesus. But the Pharisees themselves were divided into at least 2 schools or 2 houses, you might say. You've got Hillel, which is the more permissive school, and you've got Shammai, which is the more strict school. And the Hillelites said, you don't like the fact that your wife burns your toast? Yeah, divorce her. That's whatever. The Shammaites don't allow you to divorce for basically any reason, okay? Except maybe adultery. That's it. So this is a live question in Pharisaic thought. And I really do believe that most Pharisees are earnest and they want to know what's the right thing to do here. But these Pharisees are not coming to Jesus in order to learn from him. They're not even coming to Jesus in order to get him on one side or another. They're coming to him to discredit him. They want to use this thorny question as a means by which to demonstrate that Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay? Now, that kind of puts an interesting spin on this whole discussion, but Jesus goes ahead and answers the question. But let's look at the question first, because actually the way that you frame this question really does matter. Is it lawful, they ask, for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, for us, our eyes are probably attracted to the end, the for any and every reason part. And that, that's understandable. But I want us to focus earlier up in the question. Remember what I just said. How you frame the question says a lot about you and how you are thinking about this issue. So notice, is it lawful? Now, I don't think that the Pharisees intended what I'm about to say. But it is the unavoidable effect that when you frame a question in terms of, is it lawful? You are framing the question in terms of, what can I do? What can I get away with? Rather than in terms of the question, in terms of what will please God. You're looking for a minimalist ethic instead of a maximalist ethic. Okay? Now again, that's not what they think they're doing. But it is the invariable result of how this question is framed. And then notice, for a man to divorce his wife. We've already observed that in Jewish settings, only men had the right to divorce. But the way that the question lands, it just feels wrong. And one of the reasons that it feels wrong, Jesus is going to point this out here in just a moment. One of the reasons that it feels wrong is because the way that we frame marriage says a lot about how we view humanity. Now, sometimes there's been lots of different marriage arrangements in human history. There are certain tribes in Nepal that practice polyandry. That is the practice of one woman having multiple husbands, usually brothers. Why do they do that? Well, because land is hard to come by in Nepal. You're in the Himalayas. And so they're trying to not dilute inheritance. Okay? But so sometimes it's just a practical concern like that. But very often, the way that we do our marriage arrangements does say something about how we view humanity. And of course, it says something about how we view marriage too. And Jesus is going to point all of this out as we turn to his response. So, now you're really focusing here on verses 4, 5, and 6, right? And we've already kind of noted that Jesus here appeals to Scripture, right? That's why we spent 3 weeks talking about the biblical foundation for this teaching. Jesus is quoting a portion of Genesis 1:26 through 28 and a portion, probably most of, Genesis 2:24. Okay? So he's quoting these texts. And in so doing, he's appealing to what for the Pharisees would be the highest authority. Now, for Sadducees, it'd be the only authority. Okay? And perhaps being in a Judean context, Jesus is like, well, yeah, Malachi answers this really well. Malachi has already answered this question if they would just read him, but just in case there's a Sadducee lurking around somewhere, I need to answer this from the law. And so that's what Jesus does. But I've often wondered, because it felt like Jesus was making a kind of a strange logical leap in putting these two fragments of text next to each other. And finally, I've been wrestling with that for years, and finally I realized, no, Jesus isn't making one point, he's making two. And of course, the most obvious point that he is making is that marriage creates a psychosomatic union. And that makes a lot of sense to us. I mean, I'm just going to say it. If you've been sexually intimate with somebody again and again and again over a course of years, especially if you've had children with them, you can't help but experience what Catholic theologians call union. There is some sense in which body and mind, body and spirit, body and, you might even say soul in a sense, not fully in the Christian sense, but there's some kind of union there. The two of you have become one, right? But that's not the only point Jesus is making. He quotes this part of Genesis 1:26 through 1 through 28 because he wants to remind them what it really means to be human. It's not just men who are human. It is women as well. God made them male and female. And they are both fully human. That reframes this whole conversation that we're having about divorce. And it exposes the androcentric, the male-centered way that this marriage arrangement had been constructed. Now, from that principle, from those two principles, I should say, really, from those two principles, Jesus extracts 4 other principles that govern divorce and that really shape the way he thinks. Now, 2 of them are explicit, 2 of them are implicit. But we're just going to work through them pretty quickly here because you could sit here and belabor this quite a lot because there's just so much really interesting stuff here that we could talk about. But we want to move a little more quickly. In part because if I preach another 50-minute sermon, y'all are going to fire me. So, all right. So one thing that Jesus is making, and this is really an important point, is this irrevocable change that happens in marriage. Jesus, it's like, Jesus thinks maybe they didn't quite hear it. So he says, after he quotes 2:24, he says, so they are no longer two, I should say, but, and then you can see Jesus doing air quotes, one flesh, right? He's emphasizing this change that takes place because they are married. There is this union that we've been talking about. Okay? So marriage draws people together. And it's not of their own doing. It is God's doing. So, of course, Jesus is like, why should you separate 2 people that God has brought together? And of course, he's talking to the men who want to divorce their wives, but he's also talking to the religious leaders who give them cover. So what God has put together, let no one separate. So God's doing this, and what has happened has brought this unity between the two. Ergo, if you divorce them, if you split them apart, you are doing violence to them. And it's not just the divorced one, although women who were forcibly divorced by their husbands for no good reason, I can't think of a more egregious violation of a person's dignity. She doesn't want the divorce. She loves her husband. In spite of everything, she loves him. But he's like, no, I don't want you anymore. I want this person. It's terrible. And that actually points us to something that is not obvious in the text, but is clearly part of this. Craig Keener, the great Matthew commentator, points this out. The way that this divorce schema was set up, it was a recipe for injustice. It was a recipe for unequal treatment. It was a recipe for putting women and their children in a very, very bad spot. Okay? Now, let's not skip to them. The Pharisees, they hear all of this, and they raise an objection. Because, of course, they're not just going to let Jesus say his piece and go, oh, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way before. Okay? No, they're not going to do that. No, they have an objection that they're going to raise. The interesting thing is they don't get it. If they did get it, they might have raised a very different kind of objection. But they don't get it. They don't really understand the radicalness of what Jesus has just said. Why don't they get it? Well, part of it is because they're focused on trying to discredit Jesus. Part of it is because they're focused on their own rivalries with each other. Have you ever been around a couple of people that are arguing and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, this is so dumb. I don't know why they're arguing about this. And the more that you think about it and the more that you listen to them, you're like, they have no idea how foolish they look. They have no idea how dumb they are. And they're arguing about the wrong thing. The thing they actually disagree about is this thing over here. That's what they ought to be arguing about. But no, they're arguing about this. The problem is, I've been the one who was doing the arguing. And no, you don't see it. You can't see it because you're too busy arguing with the other person. You can't abstract yourself enough from the conflict to go, this is stupid. What are we arguing about this for? That's what's going on with the Pharisees. So they don't really get it. So they raise this objection from Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Well, why then did Moses? But there are some problems with their objection, and Jesus points them out immediately. The first problem with their objection is that they get command and permission confused. And probably they do it intentionally. Okay? So, did you notice how Natalia read that? I love what the NIV does with this because they get this translation right. The Pharisees say, well, Moses commanded us to write her a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus says, no, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Yes, Moses did command that if they divorce, they have to give their wife a certificate of divorce. Why? Because here's what you could do. Let's say Natalia and I are living in ancient Israel. And I just decide, I want a younger woman. So I divorce Natalia, but I don't give her a certificate of divorce. Well, then my new wife, whoever that happens to be, decides that she really hates Natalia's guts for being my former wife, and she incites me to accuse Natalia of adultery because Natalia remarried. Well, of course she remarried. She needed, I don't know, food, clothing, a place to live. Well, now I could accuse her of adultery because she doesn't have a certificate of divorce, saying, no, you sorry sucker, you divorced me. That's why Moses did this. But Moses wasn't saying, hey, guys, it's open season on your wives. Whenever you feel like it, get rid of them and get another one. And that's what Jesus is pointing out. There's a difference between permission and command. The second problem is that they're just reading the Old Testament wrongly. They're just reading the Bible wrongly. Now, all of us have what we scholars call a canon within a canon. We're not really supposed to do that, but we do. We all do it. We all have certain Bible texts that we revert to and certain ones that we ignore. It's not a good practice, but we all do it. I mean, all you have to do is get a bunch of Baptists and Methodists in the same room and ask them, well, what do you think about once saved, always saved? And there goes the Donnybrook. And what you'll very quickly see is that they're not reading the same texts the other ones are. Right? Okay? We all do this. And, at some level, part of learning how to read the Bible is learning how to read it properly, because it does have to be interpreted. And so, what the Pharisees are doing here is they're saying, well, wait a minute, we're appealing to Moses. Moses is the highest authority. What Moses actually said, the law he actually gave. What Jesus is saying is, no, actually, that's not the right way to read this. The right way to read this is to go back to the beginning. The right way to read this is to look at God's intent for marriage before the fall, before sin messed everything up. There are some preachers in our own day who have made a good living denigrating the value of women, forming marriage on a Genesis 3 model. That's not how we're supposed to do this. And that's Jesus' point. In the beginning, he told the Pharisees, that's not how this went. And then the third problem is the problem of hard hearts. That's why Moses gave them permission, Jesus asserts. It's because their hearts were hard. Now, notice how Jesus kind of frames that little statement. They were they were the ones back then who had hard hearts. But Jesus, what he says is, because your hearts were hard. What he's saying is, this is a generational characteristic. In the black church, they call it generational sin. I love that idea, because what it basically says is, look, the sin of one generation gets passed down to the next, either because you do the very same thing that your parents did, or because the stuff that your parents did creates dysfunction in some other area of your life. If you want to see an example of it in Scripture, go to Genesis 12, and then later on Genesis, 26, 27, 28, somewhere in that range. Abraham tells Sarah to lie, say that she's his sister rather than his wife. Well, then Isaac, several decades later, does the very same thing. That's what we're talking about. And they've inherited this hardness of heart, this cruelty. But then Jesus takes this opportunity to expound upon his teaching. And here's the basic point he makes. Remarriage equals adultery. Now, at first, that sounds like, whoa, I'm not so sure about that, Jesus. That seems a little harsh. That seems a little radical. But think about it this way. Here's a way that we could paraphrase what Jesus is saying. If I'm supposed to be having sex with Susie, and instead I'm having sex with Annie, I can't cover that up with a fig leaf called a divorce contract. I can't use legality to cover up that indiscretion. Just because I cover it with that fig leaf called a divorce contract doesn't make it right. But there is an exception. Now, it is very difficult to determine whether this exception comes from Jesus or whether it comes from Matthew. The reason is because in the Greek of the first century, there are no parentheses, there are no brackets, there are no quotation marks. In fact, there's no punctuation at all. If you get a first or second century manuscript, a very early manuscript, all you see is a bunch of capital letters strung together. And you have to figure out where the word breaks go, and then you have to punctuate it so that, normal people like me can actually read the stupid thing. That's what our if you go to the store and you buy a Greek New Testament, you will see punctuation. Well, that's because really smart people have gone through these manuscripts and have put in punctuation. And they don't always put it in the right place, by the way, but they do the best that they can. So it's very difficult to know whether this exception comes from Jesus or from Matthew. And one of the reasons scholars suspect that it might come from Matthew is because the version of this saying in Mark's gospel doesn't have it. Okay? But let's look at the exception itself. Unless the Greek word is porneia. The NIV translated it sexual immorality. Now, if you hear an English root in there, porn, you're right. Porneia. Now, what does porneia mean? Well, there's an issue that is fraught with problems. Because porneia was used in a wide variety of ways. In the Old Testament, in Greek literature in general, perhaps in the New Testament, that gets a lot more controversial. But it was used in a wide variety of ways. Now, what I've put up for you here on the screen is 3 of the main ways that porneia was used. It was used to describe generalized sexual immorality. Now, you're like, oh, great, that's real helpful because that could cover a whole bunch of different stuff. Yeah, it does. And that's part of the problem. It could be used to describe prostitution or promiscuity. That was actually its original meaning. Porneia is related to the Greek word pornix, which means prostitute. Okay? So it was, in its earliest usages, it was used for prostitution and then by extension for promiscuity. But in the Old Testament, the word is used in a somewhat different way. Not always, just sometimes. It is used for covenant unfaithfulness, particularly Israel's unfaithfulness to God. And yes, the imagery could get very graphic. And sometimes you would have in the prophets this imagery of Israel being this young, promiscuous woman. And you're like, oh gosh, Lord, I didn't read the Bible so I could read porn. That's not what are you doing? Well, he's illustrating that Israel will worship any idol that promises to give them something. And he uses the language of promiscuity to do it. It's very graphic. But as I've told you before, the Bible is not safe and fun for the whole family. The Bible deals with real issues, and sometimes in ways that we wish it wouldn't. So, how do we make sense out of all of this? Okay, how do we pull all of that together? Well, part of what how we pull all of that together is what we're going to talk about next week. But for now, let's begin with a couple of observations. First of all, notice this does not mean adultery. It may include adultery, but it does not mean adultery. Adultery is a different word in Greek. It's moikeia. That's the word for adultery in Greek. Different word, okay? It also doesn't mean premarital sex. I am not aware that there is a Greek word for that. And one of the reasons is because they just didn't practice dating the way that we do. We'll talk about that next week too, okay? They just didn't do things the way that we do. Again, it might include that, but it probably includes that, but it doesn't explicitly point that out. And, those of you who grew up in with the King James Bible, you'd have preachers yelling about fornicators and they're, yelling at the youth group, right? That's just how that worked. Well, this word has a broader meaning than that. So what is Jesus trying to say? Well, like Richard Hayes, the Duke University New Testament ethicist, I tend to land on this issue of covenant unfaithfulness. That's the exception. Are you unfaithful to the covenant? But that's going to have a distinctively sexual quality. We'll talk about that more next week. Sorry, I know that that's uncomfortable and maybe not as specific as you would like, but, it's the Bible. We have to submit to it, not conform it to what we wish it would say. It's just kind of how it is. Now, why is this objection important? Or I shouldn't say objection. I have said that all week in my sermon practice. Why is this exception important? Well, one of the reasons that it's important is because Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 gives us a different exception. This exception is porneia, covenant unfaithfulness, especially of a sexual nature. Paul's is abandonment. So let's say you're married to a non-Christian and they just decide, you know what, you converted to this Jesus thing, I'm done with you, I'm out. Paul says, look, I don't have a word from the Lord on this, but my gut reaction to this as your apostle is, let him go. And the fact that these two objections are different, and the fact that we have one text where Jesus doesn't give, see, I said objection again, these exceptions are different, and the fact that we have one text of Jesus not giving an exception at all, suggests that part of what we're supposed to do as the church is use discernment. Remember, Matthew has already said, Jesus has said in Matthew's gospel, I should say, that, talking to the disciples, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's not carte blanche. We don't get to do whatever we want, okay? But it does, I think, give us a certain amount of discernment that we can use to listen for God's voice and hear God speak to us on really difficult and really thorny issues like divorce. And that's a big part of what we're going to do next week. Now, very quickly, let's go to the disciples' objection. Because see, the disciples, they do get it, at least in part. They understand what, the implications of what Jesus is saying. Guess what? They don't like it. Now, their objection is not exactly the most articulate thing you've ever heard, but it gets the point across. Basically, their idea is, hey, wait a minute, Jesus. Hold it. You're telling me that I can't just divorce my wife for whatever reason. And Jesus is like, And you realize that means I can't just control my wife. I can't just make her do what I say because I can't threaten her that if she doesn't do it, I'll divorce her. Jesus is like, all right. And then the disciples are like, no, I don't want to be married if that's going to be the case. Do you understand what their deal is? Remember, these disciples are all male. It makes you wonder what the women are thinking while the disciples are raising this objection. Maybe Mary Magdalene sitting there going, "Phew, I sure am glad I didn't marry one of these jokers." So the disciples they're like, no, I want to have control. I want to be not just the boss of my home. I want to be the king. And Jesus is like, okay. He doesn't read them the riot act. He doesn't give them the third degree for the hardness of their hearts, because let me tell you, their hearts are hard too. No, what does he do? You can almost see Jesus having this mischievous smirk on his face as he says, well, there's another way. You might not like it, but there's another way. It's called celibate singleness. And I can almost feel the hearts of some of these disciples drop into their stomach. Oh man, that is not what I had in mind. But I've wrestled with this little paragraph for a long time because it just didn't seem to make sense what Jesus was doing. Now I think I get it. He really is giving them another option, but he's doing something else. He's reminding them that the kingdom of heaven matters more than anything else. That's the point he wants them to get. And if you have to be celibate and single for the rest of your life to live as a citizen of God's kingdom, that's the sacrifice you need to make. And if you have to live in a marriage that is radically different than the one presented to you as good by the world, then that's what you have to do. And as we conclude, that's where I want us to start as we conclude. Okay? Because you see, while the Pharisees had their focus on their, settling their old scores with each other and on persecuting a new opponent, Jesus was thinking about his Father's kingdom. That's where his focus was. Now, I hope that you see out of this that Jesus does construct his doctrine of divorce so as to protect vulnerable persons, especially women and children. And if you're not quite there on that yet, that's okay. We'll come to that again next week, all right? But that is how Jesus constructs this doctrine. But that does not mean that his teaching is easy. The teaching of Jesus will often require us to let go of our dreams of having a happy life. And it will always require us to repudiate the desire to control other people for our benefit, to use other people as mere pawns to satiate our desires. Malachi is right. God hates divorce. And so does Jesus. It breaks a covenant. It irrevocably harms both of the participants in it, even the one who filed. And by the way, that's regardless of the justification. And it undoes the healing work that God is trying to do in the world. Nevertheless, sometimes the behavior of married persons is so egregious that it destroys the marriage before anybody even files. Some of you, unfortunately, have experienced that, haven't you?
I didn't understand that.
So, what do we do then? Now, that's why Jesus leaves open the possibility of divorce in certain circumstances. And oh, by the way, as Keener points out, if the divorce is legitimate, if the divorce is legal, if the divorce is permissible or even the will of God, then so is the remarriage. Okay? That's just a legal principle of the first century. And we see that legal principle really at work in how Jesus structures this. But we're going to have to talk next week about, okay, what kinds of things constitute a reasonable excuse for divorce, or even something where we as the church would say, you know what, you need to get out of this marriage. That's what we're going to talk about next week. Let us pray.